So I've had the Light Phone 2 for about a month now. And since I did an unboxing video, I thought it'd be nice to do a follow-up to let people know how I'm liking it and what I think about it so far. This is going to be a completely unbiased opinion. I did not receive anything from the Light Phone company to make this video, and I paid for the Light Phone completely out of pocket. The texting and the keyboard on this phone suck. There's no nice way to put it. It's just awful. It's very clunky. It doesn't really register where your fingers are touching. When I made the first video, I unboxed the phone and I just did a couple test runs with it. You got to flip the phone sideways, which is not a big deal. You have to do that because the phone is so small, and I'm fine with that if it actually registered where my fingers were touching and it was easy to type. The problem is it's not easy to type, and it takes forever to send a text because you're constantly fixing your errors and your misspellings because it just doesn't work very well. Now, it does support talk to text or voice to text. They don't really put that information up front. And had it not been for a comment on that YouTube video that I made about this phone, I wouldn't have known because someone actually mentioned it there. Considering how bad the texting is, you would have thought that they would enable voice to text by default. And the voice to text works fine. It doesn't catch every word and it does make some mistakes, but maybe I talk too fast. Maybe sometimes there's noise in the background, but it is better than having to type on this thing. So if you do get the Light Phone 2, the first thing I would do is enable the voice to text. Another thing that kind of bugged me was the dashboard and the fact that you can't really do anything on this phone directly. If you want to install music on the phone, you have to do it through the dashboard. If you want to enable certain apps, you have to do it on the dashboard. If you want to add certain podcasts, you have to do it through the dashboard. It's a minor inconvenience, but it's a little ironic that you have to use a computer or a smartphone to access the dashboard, and it's just clunky. It doesn't feel like a seamless integration. Next, I want to talk about the battery life. The battery life on this phone is okay. They advertise it for 1 to 2 days with light use. That's a bit of a stretch because I've noticed that just from the phone sitting idle, it kind of drains way quicker than you would expect it to. So if you're using it regularly, you'll definitely get a day. If you're making a lot of phone calls, if you're listening to podcasts on this thing, if you're listening to music, it's probably going to drain a lot faster. If you're using GPS, it's definitely going to drain faster. And if you're using it as a mobile hotspot, it's going to drain significantly faster. So just keep that in mind. This doesn't have a big battery. They let you know right on their webpage that it has a much smaller battery because it's a much smaller phone. But luckily, you can't really do a whole lot with this phone, so maybe you won't use the battery that much. Since I mentioned the hotspot, I figured I'd touch on that real quick. Now, I didn't use it too much. I used it just to kind of test it out and see how it worked, and it worked fine. Nothing to write home about. It can get you on the internet and do the basic stuff that you need, but you're not gonna have blazing fast internet because it's just a mobile hotspot. And if you've used mobile hotspots on phones before, you'll know that they're not that fast. Again, keep in mind the battery will drain a lot quicker. So if you are using it as a mobile hotspot, you'll probably want to have it plugged in. If you plug it in, make sure you use micro USB. That was one of the pet peeves of mine when I first unboxed it, that it was micro USB and not USB-C. But hey, it's a very small, minimal phone. At this point, I only have like one other thing that I use micro USB for, and I'm trying to just phase that out of my life completely. So it did kind of suck, but it's not a big deal. I have the charger. They send you a charging cable with it. A small complaint, a little annoyance. Not a big deal. Service. I want to talk about service on this phone, making phone calls and receiving text. I will say that I had great service with this. I didn't experience many drop calls or anything like that. Overall, the service and the reception on this phone has been great. So let's talk about music. This was one that really bugged me a lot because I love listening to music. I listen to music while I work. I listen to music while I drive. I listen to music while I work out. I listen to music a lot more than I listen to podcasts, and I'll talk about the podcast app in a second. But I was really bummed on how music is handled on the Light Phone 2. You have to do everything through the dashboard. You have to literally install music files through the dashboard in order to play them on your phone. And that felt like the jankiest setup ever. And it really just prevented me from adding any music to this phone because I don't have music files anymore. I use streaming services for all my music. I use Spotify and I use YouTube Music. I don't have any CDs. I don't have any hard drives filled with music anymore. I don't have an iPod anymore because it's not 2005. And the music that I do actually have on my iTunes account is super old music that I don't really listen to anymore. And I know that they mentioned on their website that they were looking into trying to get a Spotify integration, and I don't know if they were just blowing smoke or if that's something that's really going to happen. But from my experience with how clunky this phone has been, I just don't see how they could seamlessly integrate Spotify onto this phone. I don't think it's capable of doing it. I highly doubt that you'll be able to just use a light phone Spotify app on here. So I won't be holding my breath for that to happen. Maybe not a deal breaker if you're aiming for a minimal phone to increase your productivity, but I use music throughout my day and when I'm being productive. So it was kind of a bummer, and I ended up having to use my iPad, which is then just a big version of a smartphone, and it just felt like I was having to do extra steps to accomplish what I would normally do on a smartphone. Of course, it's not a smartphone, I get that, but they provide a music app that sucks. And that's just my brutally honest opinion on their music app. The podcast app was cool, but it's still a little janky. It's still not a seamless integration. You still had to go through the dashboard and select which podcast you want to add to your phone. So if you're on the go and you just happen to be like, oh, what's that podcast I wanted to listen to that I just thought of, or I just heard, or I'm listening to another podcast and they have a guest on there and that person has a podcast and I want to start listening to them because I really like that guest that they had on there. And now I have to go access a laptop or a smartphone or something that is capable of getting to the dashboard and then selecting that podcast and adding it to my list of podcasts within the light phone dashboard on a separate device and not through the phone. It feels like a whole lot of extra steps that I am not really happy having to take. I wish that I could just do it directly from the phone, and it doesn't feel like that would take away from my productivity. It feels like that should just be a basic functionality that you can do on this phone. Since it offers those features, you shouldn't have to use something else to add the podcast. But it was fine. I hooked up my Bluetooth headphones to it and it worked just fine. It also has an auxiliary cable jack, so you can plug in if you're into that sort of thing. But listening to podcasts was okay. Still don't like having to go through the dashboard for everything. The GPS directions, how can I say it? They felt very dated. They felt like I was using a very old GPS. I don't get out of the house much, and I used it for the sake of trying it. And I used it to go somewhere that I go all the time, which was my jiu-jitsu gym. I know the route that I take. I know how to get there. So when I set out to go to my jiu-jitsu gym and I used the light phone navigation or directions, I was surprised how bad it was. It couldn't find my gym. It found a couple other jiu-jitsu gyms in the area, and it found some that were further away, but it's not like my gym just opened recently. Like, my gym has been there for years now, for like 5-6+ years, maybe longer. But I trained there when I first moved here in 2019, and it was in the same location, and it hasn't moved, and it was there before I started training there. So the fact that it didn't come up on their list was a little annoying, and I don't know the address. So then I basically found the Home Depot that's in the same parking lot as my gym, and I set the route to Home Depot because I knew it would get me there. That was the first annoying part. I did that when I was at home, and when I started driving, I realized that everything was in metric, not imperial. I tried to change it, but I couldn't because I had directions going. But I basically had to cancel out the directions that I had because it wouldn't let me change the settings while the directions were going. So I canceled out the directions, and then I changed it to imperial, and then I tried to go back to the directions, but then it wasn't finding my previous directions, so I had to re-enter the Home Depot. And all while doing this, I'm like pulled over on the side of the road because I'm not gonna like text and drive and try to figure out a phone I don't know how to use while I'm driving. And the fact that the keyboard sucked and I was trying to type it in when I was doing that was just annoying. And then it goes offline. And even though I have great reception, full bars, no problem, the maps won't go back online. And then I drive a little bit more and I try it again and it finally like kicks in, but then I noticed that it kept going offline. And overall, like the written or verbal directions were okay. The map itself was atrocious. It was awful. It really wasn't good. I felt like I would have been better off printing out MapQuest directions. I'm gonna be driving around with one of those giant maps trying to figure out where I'm going if I have to use this phone all the time. So I really missed my maps from my smartphone. Thankfully, I was going somewhere that I knew how to get to, but I would not trust this thing to get me somewhere that was like an important appointment or just to get anywhere really, because I think that the GPS directions were pretty bad on this phone. And by now you're probably starting to see that I'm not really happy with this phone, but I want to talk a little bit about the rest of the apps before I give my final opinion on this phone. So for the other apps, there's a calculator, there's an alarm, and there's a note-taking app. The note-taking will take voice and text notes. It kind of sucked. I'd rather use paper and pen, if I'm being honest. It's a lot easier for me to just jot down my notes here on my legal pads that I have, and I have little other pads, and I take notes everywhere, and I just jot them all down because it's just that much easier. And the calculator and alarm work as you would expect them to. And then that's pretty much it for all the apps. I want to give my last opinion now. I will say that this phone feels like, for what it does and for what it's supposed to be, it would be great if it cost like $100. I don't feel that I get $300 of value out of this phone. I feel that most of the apps are very clunky. It almost feels like I would be better off using an old flip phone and texting in T9 when I have to. And as far as it limiting distractions, I will say that it does that. But for a person like me who works from home, who doesn't get out of the house much, and is usually just in his office the whole time, there's no difference than me leaving my smartphone upstairs and just trying to use it less and having a little bit of self-control. I'm really bad about that. I have a social media smartphone problem, and that's why I got this phone to begin with. But I don't think that this phone is my solution to this. I think that I need to look into some more things. I know that there's this brick thing that's for iPhone. I'm gonna try that brick thing because it seems to be pretty cool. I've done a little research on it, but I just found other ways to distract myself. I have to use my iPad for music. So I have an iPad sitting right there at my desk. I'm also on a computer all day, and I have access to my personal computer and I have access to my work computer, and I can easily distract myself on those things as well. And I really tried to just not use my smartphone at all. I put it away and I used the light phone for a while now, and I gotta say, I'm gonna go back to a smartphone. I'd be lying if I said that I used this thing the whole time for the last month. I used it for my work day mostly, and then when I was hanging out with my wife and kids, I just left my smartphone in the other room. But I still use my smartphone occasionally, and this path of trying to find digital minimalism and get a dumb phone and do things to limit my social media intake and to do things to get me to just be on my electronics less is something that I have to use willpower and self-control, because you're always going to find ways to get around this stuff if you really want to consume content and scroll and do all that stuff. Sure, you can get this dumb phone, but at the end of the day, if you don't make the effort, you'll find ways to go check out Reddit or Twitter on your iPad or on your laptop or however you can. Web TV. Talk about dating myself. If you guys know what Web TV is, drop a comment down below because you're old as like I am. All right, with that said, I hope this review of me using the light phone for the last month and telling you what I honestly thought about it was helpful. If you still want to buy it, I'll put an affiliate link in the description because I will shamelessly make $30 from it. But just be aware that a lot of people who are talking about this phone do get a commission from it, like I would if you were to buy it from that link. And they might be talking up this phone more than you would expect. And it's just not as good as I had hoped. If you told me this phone was $100, I would say go buy it every time, but for the price, I don't think it's worth it. And I feel that you will only distract yourself with it for so long until you go back to a smartphone. We're just too used to it and it's too hard to give up. At least it was for me. I'm just trying to be better about it and being more aware of how I use it. All right, with that said, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, and I'll see you next time.